Welcome to the Launch Michigan podcast, where education policy meets real action. Hosted by President and CEO Vanessa Kiesler. We cover research, workforce development, advocacy, and community organizing, from literacy and staffing models to redesigning high school and connecting students to trades, community colleges, and more. The Launch Michigan podcast. Big ideas, real solutions.
Thank you for joining us today. We are really excited to be here today with Dr. Adrea Truckenmiller from Michigan State University, and I'm going to let her introduce all her titles because she has many. We're here to talk about literacy. Our title for this session is From Literacy Wars to Literacy Systems, How Assessment Data and Systems Drive Reading Success. And Adrea is really one of the frontline researchers in literacy in general, but one of the major people in our state who is calling for more than just literacy, right? Like literacy isn't just books. It isn't just curriculum. There's a number of things that we need to be successful. So Adrea, would you mind introducing yourself a little more extensively and then we'll jump into it?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Vanessa. I'm excited to be here. I am an associate professor of special education and school psychology at Michigan State University. I've been here for 10 years now, since 2016. And have done a lot of research, especially in the area of writing, because writing is so necessary for building reading, also social studies, science, math, health knowledge. I take a very systems approach because of the experiences that I've had prior to coming to MSU. Prior to coming to MSU, I was at the Florida Center for Reading Research, where I was the director of several statewide projects. I was the director of the statewide reading screening assessment in Florida, as well as running several other U.S. Department of Education funded studies with Dr. Barbara Foreman. And then prior to being at FCRR, I was at the Devereaux Center for Effective Schools, where I learned a lot about systems change and how to enact systems change by using something called positive behavior interventions and supports, which many schools in Michigan have, thanks to my MTSS, which was formerly my Blissey, that did a lot of work in that. We watched a lot of that work, and then I learned how to do that in Pennsylvania. So thinking systems-wide is very different than thinking about individual students sitting in front of you. So all of that excellent experience that I had from those places and from my extensive research building the research-based practices that we want to put into place, I created a master's degree program and certificate program at MSU called Leadership in Multi-Tiered System of Supports, TSS. So we have a master's degree here that I helped create so that we can train in-service teachers and leaders in Michigan as well as across the country, because it's online, so it's available to everybody. So that's a little bit of my background.
Thanks. It's really exciting. And I was thinking as you were talking, for our listeners, if you haven't been tracking the literacy conversation in this country, and I'm not even going to go back to like the dawn of time. I'm going to go back to like 2010s-ish, when I feel like that's when people were starting to say, oh, what should we be doing? What is the science of reading? There'd been, and Adrea, you can tell me which part of this narrative you might agree with or disagree with. I feel like in the 2000s and the 2010s, there'd been a really big focus on the gold standard in research, RCTs. What reading programs can we study within RCT, a randomized control trial? And that's really important science that the nation needed to do. We needed to increase the rigor of education research, and we needed to use the gold standard of causal inference, a randomized control trial, to study education. And when you study education using a randomized control trial, you have to make the treatment or the intervention discrete enough that you can test it and that you can do it in an RCT way. And so we had a lot of focus on programs that did reading or literacy that showed effects, and they did show effects. That was good evidence-based practice. But it also, I think, kicked off a conversation around implementation science. Not all those programs worked the same when you scaled them, when you took them into other contexts. And it also kicked off a conversation around the reading wars. Is it phonics, and is it some of these pieces, or is it this whole language? And those go back further from the 2010s. Back under State Superintendent Mike Flanagan, I sat in the room, the Runkle room is the room at the Department of Ed, with Mike Flanagan, with all the other deputies in 2013. And Mike said, we have to do something about literacy. What are we going to do about early literacy? So the department had an early literacy goal back 13 years ago. around the same time that Mississippi was starting its miracle, around the same time that Florida was really already deep into the work. I think you were probably already at the Florida Center at that point. When Michigan said, what do we do about this? We were still fighting, I think, to some degree about, is it science of reading? The term science of reading hadn't really been coined in this way yet. That was coming. But is it more of this phonics approach, or is it whole language, or is it something else? There was also the challenges of early childhood and K-12 don't connect well in terms of how they think about learning and assessment and whatnot. So Michigan struggled we set a goal that day, we articulated a series of strategies, and then Michigan, the legislature, the governor's office, state budget office started on what became eventually the Read by Grade 3 legislation. Shortly after that, there was all these groups, or this like work group that met. John Kennedy co-chaired it, a businessman on the West Side, if you don't know him. Anyway, and so Michigan was trying to ask the same question as Mississippi about what should we do as a state to get us there. And that original Read by Grade 3 law that got passed had a lot of good things, was in the right direction in a lot of ways. It said early intervention. It said use data to screen. It said put kids on a plan. It became about the retention requirement, like that all the debate became around the retention requirement. But all that early intervention, data screening, all of that is good work. And what Michigan didn't do that I think Florida, Mississippi, others did, is we didn't say, this is the curriculum you're going to use. This is the assessment. These are the practices you have to use. It wasn't a systems approach. It was a law with some pretty good requirements, but too much room for districts to choose whatever they thought would work. And again, the science was younger. So when we talk about science of reading, we have a decade plus of really good research that has led to the science of reading. That wasn't there in 2013. Adrea was actually building it at the Florida Center. But just to give everybody context, when people are like, well, why hasn't Michigan gotten to where Mississippi has? To me, I would say it's that we just didn't go far enough with the system part of it. We stopped at some of the requirements, but then we let 800 plus districts make a lot of decisions. And those districts, while well-intentioned, don't have the right data, the right research. They're not all curriculum assessment data experts. They don't know. And so now we're at another crux where we're like, we want our own miracle here. I think we have to learn from that lesson. And it looks like we are starting to. We have to be more willing as a state to say, yes, local control, yes, what works. And not everything works equally well. And we have to not be afraid to say some things are good and some things are not good. And we don't use the bad things. Like, just don't. If you want your kids to read, don't use the bad things. So that is just some history, some context. Again, Adrea has been at the front line of getting us to a place as a nation where we know something about literacy. We can do something about it. And she's really excellent at being practical about what are we going to do. So we didn't just study it, but what are we going to do about it?
Absolutely.
So within that framing, well, Adrea, did you want to add anything to my long history of literacy in Michigan and the nation?
I love that, Vanessa. Thanks. I learned a whole bunch about Michigan. That was really helpful with that framing. That's great. Yeah, I forgot to mention in the intro, like you said, I was in Florida in 2013. So while you were sitting there having that conversation, that's when the Mississippi things started. And so I was at the Regional Laboratory Southeast at Florida State, which also served Mississippi. So we went over to Mississippi and worked with the amazing team there with Carrie Wright, the state superintendent, and she brought in Dr. Kimyana Burke, who directed their Read by Grade 3 guarantee, and working with Dr. Burke was amazing. And we brought together, they hired 60 literacy coaches statewide, went in and trained them, and they did all of the comprehensive, coherent systems things that you talked about. So I love that you're on this systems track.
We're going to talk a lot about systems today. So both Adrea and I have articulated something around literacy. Adrea has stood up Spartan Reads. Launch Michigan has a platform called Every Child Reads. You listeners can guess that they are going to be similar in what they talk about. And they both stem from the same place. Again, we should not be afraid to say what works and what doesn't work. We should not wonder. There are plenty of things in education where the science isn't clear on what the best way is. We're still studying it. It's hard to study. This is one where the science has advanced and we have evidence. So why would we not take the evidence and use it into practice? So for Launch Michigan, Every Child Reads is our thought leadership platform around literacy. READS is an acronym. So R is right curriculum. Every district needs to have high quality, not just curriculum and instructional materials, the whole suite. But you have to have the right one. Research by Epic has shown last time they checked, there were still over 400 different curricula in use in Michigan. I don't know exactly how many of those are good. Adrea probably does, but I can tell you 400 of them are not good. That's not true. That's not possible. So right curriculum, every educator trained. We've been very supportive of the requirement that is working its way through the legislature right now of every educator being required to do letters or a similar training so that every elementary educator has the right training. And then A, D, and S are what we want to talk about more today. Assessments that measure the right things, data that's actionable, and a systems approach to literacy. And so Launch wants to make sure that when the state's because Michigan loves to do this, we love to do the Michigan 180, we love to do the silver bullet. What's the magic? Why isn't our literacy improving? Where's the magic wand? We want to be like, there is no magic wand, and our search for a magic wand has set us back. So if we want to be Mississippi, we have to stay the course and do these actions and do them with fidelity, or else we will not see gains. We will not. There is no secret. There is no easy button. There is systems approach to literacy, and that's it. So that's our platform. Do you want to talk a little bit about Spartan READS, Adrea, and just high level kind of what you created it for and what you're using it for?
Yeah, I always had the question, what actually works? And in my training, I got slices of what works. And that's a pretty common story across any educator, that we've gotten slices of it. And it doesn't cover the whole comprehensive difficulty of reading. Literacy is complex because there's multifacets, and most of us can only be experts in one or two at most. So I was wondering what works especially when working with kids. I would work with a student and what I was using wasn't working with that student. So I wanted to know what it was. So I did a really deep dive into the research and took many years and many people and reading a ton to find the things that work best for the different components of reading and literacy. And luckily, very recently, Young-Suk Kim, an amazing professor who's at University of California, Irvine, and she was previously at the Florida Center for Reading Research, where I was at as well, came out with a comprehensive model of reading development and shows how reading develops over time and interacts with different skills. So her model is called the Interactive Dynamic Literacy Model. It's pretty complex, but it's complex because that's how reading develops. And so I took each of the components of her model and I looked at what is the most effective program for each of those components that we found in the gold standard, in those RCTs that you so nicely teed up, Vanessa. So I found them, went to the research, and I found all of those. And I put them together in a program because I thought, okay, if I was struggling as an educator, and I know many other educators are struggling with what's the thing to start with, let's start with the thing that's most likely to work. And then if that doesn't work, then we'll go on to something else. Or once a student's mastered everything in that program, then we can go on and do the more advanced things that we all want to teach. So I found those components and I put them together and I said, this is what I want to see every one of our educators coming out of Michigan State University with this toolkit, that they're ready to go. They run into, this student needs help with text structure. I know exactly what is the first best step for text structure and how to teach text structure. And I'm going to go to this program. I'm going to use knowledge acquisition and transformation framework for that. This student's struggling with decoding. I'm going to go use UFly. All of our special ed pre-service teachers are now trained in UFly. My student struggling in oral language. All of our special ed pre-service teachers are trained in Story Champs. So I wanted them to have this toolkit of intervention and then also assessment to make sure that instruction they're using is working. And when it's not working, to adjust.
Spartan READS is so exciting to me as a person who's spent a lot of time around research, but really in that intersection of policy, practice, and research. You took the time. You are the expert. You understand RCTs. You understand, was this a good study? Was it not? You took the time to take all of that that's out there and put it into a practical field guide almost for educators so that people don't have to wonder, is what I'm using good or not? And I know your average classroom educator or your average district leader wants to use the highest quality thing. No one is purposely choosing a low quality thing. But when people can't get or they don't know, then they have to rely on the manufacturer, the company, or what their friends use or whatever. So this is just such a practical translation of all this high quality research into something that practitioners can use. Listeners, if you aren't familiar, we'll make sure we have the link with this video. More people need to use it in our state. So we're excited about it.
Thanks for that, Vanessa. I appreciate how you describe that.
So we talked a lot about Every Child Reads, Spartan Reads. Let's get under the hood a little. When people talk or hear about improving literacy, they often think about curriculum, right? Like, what are you teaching in the classroom? But you've shared in a number of ways that assessment systems, data systems, and really the system overall are just as important as the curriculum. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about a system, in particular, and what works really well in schools is usually a 3-tiered system. So you have the curriculum, the enacted curriculum that everybody's getting, usually called tier 1 or the universal tier of this is the instruction that we've chosen at our school. And of course, it's not going to work for everyone. And so you need to have a coordinated way to identify who gets supplemental, what that supplemental is, and then intensifying that supplemental instruction. And so in order to do that, you can't do it blind, right? You need some type of information that's going to inform both the who and the what. And that information needs to be accurate, and it needs to be accurate for the content that it's measuring. So that's where it's been really tricky because most of the time, curricula and assessments are studied independently by themselves. So this tier 1 curriculum is studied, this tier 2 intervention is studied by itself, this one universal assessment of phonics is studied by itself, this other assessment of reading comprehension is studied by itself, and very rarely are they all studied together. And so that makes it really challenging and takes a lot of expertise to coordinate all of those decisions into one place. So that's what I've been trying to focus my research on, is how to bring all those multiple decisions and multiple things and content considerations and accuracy considerations together.
Great. I want to segue a little bit. It's related to decisions, bringing decisions together, but dig in a little bit more on both the assessment and the data components. And again, I'll do just a little bit of Michigan history for everybody. We have invested really heavily in literacy over the last 10 years. We've invested in literacy coaches. We've invested in high quality instructional materials. We're doing a better job now of requiring districts use the evidence-based high quality instructional materials, not a broader realm. We've invested in interventions, but we haven't invested enough. And we have, as a state, there is money for benchmark assessments, which are the assessments that you take multiple times during the year. Some of those let you understand about how reading is developing. Some of them don't, kind of depends. We can talk more about that. But what we have not done as a state is invested really specifically in one assessment that everybody takes besides the state MSTEP. We have that. But that's a one-time-a-year assessment. That happens at the end of the year. It's meant to be that. It's called a summative assessment. You know this, Adrea, but just in case people don't spend all their time thinking about assessments, I'll just share. The MSTEP is called a summative assessment because it summarizes what's been learned. But also, sometimes people call it like a postmortem. Like, if you haven't learned it and you take the MSTEP, you haven't learned it. Yet at the end of the year, that year's gone. So Michigan has not invested in one assessment or two or tools, several tools that we can use that everybody takes. And we've not invested in that data coming together in a way that's very visible, not only to the teacher and the school, but to the district, to the state. So we are blind. We just have to cross our fingers every year and hope more kids are proficient, when actually we could have better data and information sooner. And that's critical for course correction while you're in the middle of the year, right? You don't want to wait until it's over and then be like, oh, that didn't work. You want to know sooner. So So we have done a lot of investment in literacy. We've given some money to districts, but we're still not really there in terms of how we're using assessment and data too. So that's the other thing. I think people get really excited about the assessment, but if all you do is give the assessment and then move on with your life, you don't take the data from the assessment and use it for decisions and use it to drive interventions and use it to inform what you're doing, then it's just a waste of time actually at that point. So I just wanted you to comment on, how do you see the assessment landscape? How should we be moving in this space? And how can we do a better job with getting the right data and working into the right system around assessment and data?
What an awesome question. I heard two big buckets in what you were talking about. One being a system of data for basically the whole state, and one being more actionable information. I'll start with the system-wide piece of things, and I will give examples of two other states that have done this really well. One of those is Florida, where I was at, and like I said, I was the director of the statewide assessment. And they had a common database where every single student in the entire state had a state ID. And starting in 2002, they all took the Dibbles edition in kindergarten through third grade. I can't even remember which edition that was back in 2002, but from 2002 to 2007, every single student took this 3 times a year. And if they moved to a different school, their data followed them because they had a state ID and it was all in this central place. And then in 2007, they updated to an assessment that Barbara Foreman had created that incorporated vocabulary as well, which the Dibbles hadn't at that point. They expanded up until 8th grade. And what was amazing with this state-level database is that it was held by the Florida State University. So there was researchers there who had a very practical bent as well. And so they would get together with a coaching network very regularly, a few times a year. And they would say, okay, what's going on in the schools? What do you need help with? What are some of the things that you're running into? And they would go to this statewide database and research what the coaches were seeing to find answers. And they were also doing their own research questions that would then inform practice. So there was this beautiful feedback cycle between literacy experts who had research skills and the coaching network that could go back to their schools and do a train the trainer model, and also then bring back the real practical questions. So this feedback loop was absolutely essential. And to your point earlier, Vanessa, what has produced the current science of reading is based on a lot of that work that was conducted in Florida. Virginia has a similar model in that they have this partnership between the University of Virginia and the rest of the state. They provide a ton of the professional learning for the in-service teachers. One of the cool things that Michigan's doing that's kind of new is making sure that this is in the pre-service educator space too. And I'm super excited about having some more consistency and collaboration between in-service and pre-service educators. So that's been fun with that systems approach.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate you drawing the distinction between statewide data that we need and data for decision-making at the local level. I want to focus for just a minute. And this is in Launch's platform. So I'll just take a minute to elevate this and put it out there for our listeners to think about. You know, if the state is already buying benchmark assessment, but we buy 4 different benchmark assessment. And again, not every benchmark assessment would work for all of these things. But if we're already investing into assessments that are more frequent than the state summative, and literacy is our top goal as a state, then why wouldn't we pay for, at the state level, the right assessment tools, require that they all be taken? There's a matrix of who needs to take what when, but require that they be taken. Michigan hates to do this sometimes because we have the Headley Amendment. We have all this weirdness about data sharing. But if we have law that requires that the data be submitted, then districts have to do it. And we need to do that. We need to pay for the right assessments beyond the MSTEP. We need to require that the data come to the state, and then we need a public way to see how we're doing sooner. So we just really want to call for that. We want to lift that up in this next budget cycle. We've tried this in the past, but the things that have stood in the way are local control or, well, I like this system. I want to use what I'm using. And then obviously there's vendors in the space. So there's a lot of lobbying that happens, but Michigan won't make systemic change if we don't have a system. And this is a really important part of a system. So I think we should learn a lesson from Florida and their database and what they were able to do with it. And again, it wasn't just that they had a database, it's that they were using it to regularly make sure kids were reading. And also, if they weren't, make the right decisions about what happened next at a state level, at a local level.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that's the perfect transition to that second part of what do we need to measure? And that's a really tricky piece of things and making sure it's the right thing. And so that's been a challenge across the country. I've been working with a lot of states, actually. I'll give, for example, Connecticut, similar to many other states in the country, was reviewing the commercially available reading screeners that are out there and wanting to know which ones are the best. Every state has different assessments that make their list because no assessment's perfect, right? And they're all trying to get better as we go through time. I helped them review, and so I got a really good look under the hood at a lot of different assessments and their various strengths and weaknesses. But one of the things that we've learned from quite a bit of research, not just on what the assessments are that are out there, but from federally funded research grants, is what to pay attention to when and what we're seeing. So one of the biggest challenges in Michigan, and I'm going to front load the punchline right here, is Michigan almost has a universal assessment. Over 90% of schools in Michigan are using the NWEA MAP growth in kindergarten through second grade and in the later grades. And in my most current reviews, we all assumed that it was doing pretty well. And the statistics behind it are pretty darn good for grades 3 through 8, especially. It lines up almost perfectly with the M-STEP and can predict who is going to be proficient or not proficient on the M-STEP. And that's what it was designed to do. And it's doing a great job of that. And I had assumed previously that it was also doing fine for K2 because they had this really unique downward scale down into kindergarten, first and second grade. Is really nice to see this longitudinal scale all the way through the grade levels. But when I dug deeper for the evidence, all the states that I've worked in that have done a really good job in literacy, nobody's using MAP growth in kindergarten through second grade. And they're all using other assessments that tell you more detailed information. So I was like, I wonder what's going on here. And so I dug a little deeper and looked at the MAP growth assessment. And I found two things. One is that it's not detecting phonics development in those early grade levels, which is absolutely 100% essential to detect because almost all of reading in those early grade levels is learning how to decode the words. So knowing what the words say. A lot of the words are pretty easy in knowing what they mean because it's things that are imageable, like cat. The cat on the mat, right? Or the cat in the hat. Those things we can see, those are easy vocabulary words. So it's not the vocabulary that's the problem. It's decoding, breaking the code of English. That's hard. And so MAP growth was not detecting that in kindergarten, first and second grade. And the result has been that it's only picking up about half of the reading problems that are occurring in kindergarten, first and second grade. And you can see that, every district can see that in their own data, where if they look at their reading proficiency level on the M-STEP in third through fifth grade, and they see more than 50% of their students are not proficient on M-STEP, and then they look at their kindergarten, first and second grade data on the MAP growth, and they see that it's only detecting 20 to 30% of students being below benchmark on the MAP growth assessment. Clearly, this has been giving schools this false security that their kindergarten, first and second grade curriculum is doing just fine, and students are making 1 year's worth of growth. That's what they've been using map growth for, and that's what it's been good at, is detecting this growth. But it's not sensitive enough to detect the right things. We need to go back and change our curriculum in kindergarten, first and second grade, because that's the place where we're going to be most effective. You mentioned this earlier. The research really consistently shows that if we want students to be proficient by third grade, we cannot wait till third grade. It must happen in kindergarten, first, second grade, and of course, pre-K, having expanding early childhood opportunities where we have high quality literacy instruction and language exposure happening in that pre-K space too. And so the biggest takeaway there is we've got to measure the right thing. And there was a really amazing article by one of my colleagues, Tiffany Hogan, who is the foremost researcher in developmental language disorder and language development. And she wrote this article with the title called, "If We Don't Look, We Can't See." What she's calling out is that we're not measuring across the board language comprehension. And there's just as many kids who struggle with language comprehension as students who struggle with decoding. There's just as many students with developmental language disorder as there are students with dyslexia. And the reason we don't know about it is because we're not measuring language comprehension. There's a parallel point of in Michigan, we're so far behind, we also aren't looking for decoding difficulties. And because we're not looking for decoding difficulties, we're not seeing them. The other big point I want to make is it's not just about detecting if students are having a difficulty. It's more about detecting our curriculum challenges and where our curricula are lacking. A while ago, EPIC did a study. EPIC is the policy center, research center here at Michigan State, did a study that showed that the top 3 curricula used in the state are 3 curricula that are notoriously known for not having enough decoding instruction happening. And we weren't looking for decoding problems in our curricula, but we had them. And so if you don't look, you can't see is a major issue in choosing our assessment.
Thank you for that explanation. That was awesome. And I just want to highlight a couple things you said and just name this for everybody listening. If we really want to see improvement as a state, if we want to see improvement for every child, if we really want every child to read, we have to be willing to be honest about what the data are saying. This is not like a NWEA hit piece or something, but you said 90% of districts are using NWEA in grades K2, and it's not picking up half the problems, I think. I mean, that's a real shortcut to what you said, but
yeah, roughly.
And doing great actually in grades 3 through 8. So it's actually not criticizing the assessment overall. It's saying it's not appropriate for what we need it to do in grades K2. But think about it from a district's perspective. They're faithfully giving their NWEA to all these kids. They're looking at the data. They're like, we did a great job. And they're blind on a number of things that they can't see. And then to your point, we haven't been looking for decoding or language comprehension. So again, it is not reasonable to expect every district to know what every assessment is doing, be able to make those choices. So the state needs to make the right choices or make the right decision, the easy one to make. We just need to be more assertive and be like, we know you love certain things, but that's actually not the right choice for kids. I just think that's really critical. It's like using a map that is pointing you at the wrong place or doesn't have roads or something. For being someone who's bringing that to light, the evidence is not personal. The evidence is the evidence.
That's the name of the game in education journey as well. We've all done things that what we know now, if we could go back in time, we would, but we keep learning and we keep moving forward. And when we know better, we do better.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you just one more question because we've had such a great discussion today. Just digging a little bit more into the systems idea. You talked a lot about all the systemic work that has to happen around literacy. I'm going to say something that Launch Michigan would like to call for that's a little bit more specific and tactical. Every district in this state has a MyKIP plan, their Michigan Integrated Continuous Improvement Plan. It's a plan they have to do regularly about what are they working on. Parts of it are required for different federal plans, but it's still a thing that every district has to do. It used to be called your school improvement plan. It seems to me like every district should have a literacy goal in continuous improvement plan. And the department should be checking to see if everybody has a goal. And if people have goals that are not specified the right way or focused on the wrong things, maybe there could be some technical assistance and some help. So I think that's a very practical way for Michigan to make we should have a systems approach idea real, because you say that to people, everybody's like, yes, but not everybody knows what a systems approach could look like or should look like. So that's something we're calling for that's pretty tactical. What are some of the best things we can do to make sure that we're taking a systems approach to literacy improvement in the state?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. And as you keep pointing out, a more complex answer than if we could have waved a magic wand, we would have done that already, and we haven't. And we're constantly building better ways to do systems. So I'll point out a couple of things that have worked and places where we can start from and build from. To your point about literacy plans, one thing that Florida had, and this was not current Florida, but this was Florida 2002 to 2015, is every district would put together their literacy system. And I use in one of my classes the decision tree that Miami-Dade County put together many years ago. And it was this beautiful decision tree of what the instructional pieces every single student got, and then what assessments they used. And they assessed the code part of reading. They assessed the language comprehension part of reading. They assessed the reading comprehension part of reading. And based on those separate scores, identified evidence-based interventions or supplemental practices that had an impact on those specific areas. And the reason this is really important is because teaching decoding is often the opposite of what we would do for teaching meaning, which is why people think that the pendulum is swinging. It's really not. It's that we need to use different instructional practices for code than what we use for meaning. And so when you have the different data points that point you in those directions, you use them that way. Back to that decision tree that Miami-Dade created. So they had these different scores, and they looked at students' skill profiles on those different scores, and they looked at their curriculum, and they made some changes to their curriculum, and they made some changes to here's the intervention that kids get depending on their scores. So that decision tree is a really nice plan that you can see, okay, do we have the right assessments and the right instructional materials at each tier and for each component of reading that will make us more successful? So those plans were a big part of it. One thing that got those plans in place was having a strong MTSS, multi-tier system of supports leadership team within the school. And so to create a system, you need this team approach, and you have to have the team set up, and they have to know how to use their data during the year. So after the fall screener, they need to get together and be able to read the data and use it to make these decisions following their decision tree. And so another piece where I'm super excited about what Michigan is doing is to try to help schools manage matching all of this screening data, reading screening data, with evidence-based or research-based instructional strategies. The group MAISA, which is the Michigan Association for Intermediate School District Administrators, they've been providing professional learning for the coaching network, providing professional learning for the ISDs across the state, and providing all kinds of other support. This group created an excellent tool called MiREAD. What it does is it pulls in any district that signs up for it. This web-based system pulls in their reading screening data. So currently, the approved screeners would be like Dibble's 8th M class, Amira, or the NWEA MAP Fluency. So that MAP Fluency is different than the MAP Growth Assessment. I'll just point that one out. So those are the three current screeners that are on Michigan's list. what MiREAD does is it pulls that data into a web-based platform for schools. And then schools can create their individualized reading intervention plans, those IRIPs that were required in the Read by Grade 3 legislation. And they have a database of available strategies from the My Strategy Bank that they can line up with their students' scores and say, this is the strategy or instructional approach that we're going to use for this particular student or for these groups of students or for whole classrooms of students. And so that automatically populates the reading intervention plan. And it gives a roadmap for where the educators are going to go, and then also gives everybody else at that school this overview of what interventions we're using, with whom, what resources are we using. So I'm really excited about MiREAD. I think it's pretty unique, and it's going in a really exciting direction. We're lucky enough to have a great relationship with MAISA and with the MiREAD folks, and going to take a look at doing some research on which schools are being really effective with their instructional approaches and this combination of the data with the instructional materials. And so we're going to be able to do some analyses to show what those best things are. If we can get more school districts into this collaborative database, imagine what we can learn from the amazing things that a lot of educators are doing right now in Michigan schools.
That's awesome, Adrea. Thank you so much for that really holistic and really excellent recommendations around systems work that we can do, and that really borrow from work that's already happened elsewhere or that's already happening here in Michigan. I believe the MiREAD platform can probably talk to the MyKit platform, since MAISA builds both, and the My Strategy definitely feeds both. So this is a great example of a tool that's already out there that we could, as a state as well, require everybody to be using MiREAD. There are places like this, again, where Michigan often does this, where we have the tool, we have the right thing. We just stop short of saying everybody use this because of all the reasons. Michigan struggles. I guess we're very individualistic. I don't know, every state says, oh, we're local control. We certainly are, but other local control states have said yes, and when the ability of children to read is on the line, local control kind of stops at the door, and we have to make better decisions as a state for our kids. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Adrea. Thank you, all the listeners who joined us. Please go to the Launch Michigan website at launchmichigan.org and check out our Every Child Reads framework. We'll also link to the Spartan Rates work. We look forward to seeing you all in our next session.